Today's show is sponsored by Earth Friendly Products. For over 40 years, Earth Friendly Products brought you the greenest home products for all your family needs. Learn more at ecos.com. That's ecos.com. Now, let's get to...
What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Hello and welcome back to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie, where we believe in experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and joining me now in studio, your other host, world-renowned psychic, Eddie Connor.
Thank you so much, Tony, and hi, everyone. Welcome back. As you know, our show sometimes will cover controversial topics, which is something Tony and I love here at Truth Be Told. So, Tony, I have a question for you.
Eddie, what's that?
Do you think that it's okay to use torture, especially in the world of war?
Honestly, Eddie, I don't believe torture should ever be used in any situation. And today we have the author of Mainstreaming Torture. Rebecca Gordon is here to talk about the tortures of modern warfare and who should be accountable for it.
Her newly released book, American Nuremberg, The U.S. Officials Who Should Stand Trial for the Post-9/11 War Crimes, is a book that talks all about how our government took actions after 9/11 in the name of national security. Please put your hands together and welcome author Rebecca Gordon.
She didn't know we had a live audience.
Yay!
Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for being here and part of Truth Be Told.
It's a pleasure. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, one thing about you, it's because this is such a touchy subject, and it's very, especially with the election going on right now, and you know the Donald Trumps and everybody else. So this is very relevant. But first, before we get talking about your books, we want to talk about your what you do and how did you get to the point of writing these books?
Okay. So what I do, I actually teach in a university. I have the best job in the world. I get to talk with young people about their deepest values at the very time in their life when they're trying to figure out what that is. I teach ethics with service learning. So my students, we study a lot of theory in the classroom, and then they work in local community-based organizations to get a real experience of what life is like in the city of San Francisco, especially for some of the people who have a bit less privilege in this city. But I wasn't always an academic. For many years, I supported myself doing work as actually an accountant.
Oh.
This is a very good way to make a living. All you need to do is know how to add and subtract debits and credits. That's all there is to it. But I used that as a way of also being able to have the time and space to be involved in a number of the movements for justice and liberation that have existed during my lifetime, which has been longer than you might think.
So what was the very first thing that caught your heart on fire, that put you out on the picket line or put you front and center with something? What was the first thing that really set you off internally to want to understand what was really going on behind that curtain?
I grew up in Washington, D.C.
Well, that's all you need to say.
No. And end of the interview. No, just kidding.
It was, at that time, a black city, a southern city, and a city that had no elected government. The entire city was run by the House and Senate district committees, who were mostly composed of Dixiecrats who really did not care at all about the population of the city that was called the capital of the free world.
Wow.
And so really my first awareness of political issues was probably the issue of race and racism. And the first demonstration my mom took me to was a demonstration about civil rights.
Oh, great.
So, yeah, then along came the Vietnam War and a whole bunch of other issues over the years I've been fortunate enough to be part of. But that was the beginning for me.
Wow. And so you said you were a professor.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the years that you have been doing that job, that career, tell us one moment in all of those years where one of your students said something that just changed you on a higher level.
Wow. Okay. So actually, there was one just this semester that blew me away. About 15% of the students at our university come from the People's Republic of China, from China. And many of them are very good students, but they speak almost no English. And I mean, really almost no English. So I have a student named Teng Hu, who's a wonderful student. His English is very broken. But we were talking about Aristotle, and he wrote a homework paper that had to do with Aristotle. And one of the things that he talked about was what he called the beauty of small lives. And he talked about how important the lives of the most ordinary people can be, and
Oh, wow.
how beautiful that can be. And it just absolutely blew me away. Another thing that happened this semester, we were talking about the issue of harm reduction and whether or not people who are using IV drugs and other drugs should have, for example, be able to have access to needle exchange. And a big argument happened in the class, which was great, because it's always great when the students argue. It means that they're engaged and they care about what's being talked about.
Yeah.
So after class, this student walked up to me, unrolled his shirt, and showed me the scars of his tracks.
Oh.
Wow.
And said, I just want you to know that today's conversation really hit home for me.
Oh.
And it just, you never know who is sitting in the classroom and what their life experience has been, which means you have to be gentle with everybody because you never know.
Well, I mean, we're talking about some amazing subjects in this. I mean, and sounds like you've touched so many lives, because other people have touched yours throughout the years. And I always think it's great about giving back.
Yeah.
Because if people mentor you, you should mentor back and help others.
Even exchange of energy.
Exactly. But when I see the subjects that you've written about, mainstreaming torture, and then the newly released book, American Nuremberg. So tell me, when did this become an interest? Let's start with beginning with the first book and say how did this become an interest of yours?
So that's a really good question. In the 1980s, there were 6 months when I actually lived in the war zones of Nicaragua.
Oh.
And my job there this was a time when, against the U.S. law, the CIA and other parts of the United States government were supporting the army that was trying to overthrow the people who had thrown out a dictator named Somoza. So these were the Sandinistas, who were the government at the time. And the Contra were the people who were trying to overthrow them. And in the context of those 6 months, I met people who had been tortured. I met people who had been torturers. And it became really clear to me that torture as an institution is something that's deeply connected with military activity and in the way that someone like a dictator, something like a repressive or autocratic government, keeps control of its people. So after September 11th, after those terrible attacks, I began watching the news because I knew that however the U.S. responded, the response was going to be a military response.
Yep.
Right.
And I knew that somebody somewhere was going to get tortured. And, it was as soon as November of 2001 that I saw the first article calling for torture.
Uh-huh.
And it was in Newsweek. And it was by a man named Jonathan Alter, who is a liberal pundit and a historian. He's since written a very well-received biography of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And what the title of his article was, Time to Think About Torture.
What?
And what he went on to say in this article was, the people the FBI has arrested who they think might know about who did these terrible crimes aren't talking. And we need something to jumpstart the investigation.
Mm, mm, mm.
Well, who was he talking about?
Exactly.
In the few days, and a lot of people don't remember this, but in the weeks immediately after September 11th, the FBI rounded up about 600 Muslims who were living in the United States. They weren't US citizens. Some of them had green cards. Some of them were here on tourist or student visas. They were all legally here in the US, although some of them had expired visas. They were taken to a jail in Brooklyn, New York, and they were held incommunicado for 6 months. Their friends didn't know where they were. Their parents
Oh
didn't
my
know
God.
where they were. They weren't allowed to talk to a lawyer. And during that time, they were tortured. At least one of them was raped with a police flashlight.
Mm.
They were beaten with electrical cords. They were handcuffed to radiators. They were put outside in the February cold wearing nothing but bare feet and a hospital gown. Not one of these people had anything to do with September 11th. Not one of them was ever charged with anything to do with terrorism. But these were the people that Jonathan Alter was prepared to see tortured because they might possibly know something about who had committed this crime.
That sounds
And
like
that
the
was just
internment
smart.
internment camps of when Japan attacked, and they just came and took homes. They just told them to
Property,
leave.
businesses,
Yep.
and
Yep.
then
And
rip
I'm
them
in
away.
California where that happened.
Right.
Wow.
So, and this is something that I don't even remember them talking about. So, how long did it take before that got to the public?
Well, this is the thing. It was in the newspapers all along. And the same thing, I saw the first article about torture that talked about torture outside the United States in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
I think it was either December 2001 or January of 2002. It was an article by a reporter named Dana Priest in the Washington Post, and it was about how the CIA was using what they called stress and duress tactics
Right.
at Bagram Air Force Base, where they were holding people that they had picked up in Afghanistan on the battlefield. So already we knew the language wasn't, they weren't saying torture, they weren't calling it
Right.
torture, but all you had to do was read the New York Times and the Washington Post. That's the thing. It wasn't a secret. There's this wonderful theologian named William Kavanaugh, and he calls this sort of now you see it, now you don't part of torture, the striptease of power. So it's sort of like, we'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing. Same way we had Dick Cheney right away, like 12 days later, saying, we're not going to tell you exactly what it is. We're going to protect you, but we're going to have to work the dark side.
Mm.
And then Cofer Black, who was the head of the National Security Administration, goes up to Congress a month after September 11th, and he says, look, I can't tell you what we're doing. All you need to know is there was a before 9/11 and an after 9/11. After 9/11, the gloves come off. So, in a sense, the administration was already signaling to the people of this country, look, you are in terrible, terrible danger. Only terrible things are going to keep you safe. We're going to do it, but this is going to be the price.
I just find it funny, and because every generation has had a situation like this where it's the fear of our government. They tell us a fear so they can implement torture or an invasion or some sort of situation to where it's always going back to fear.
And what they never tell you is how much your own government is involved in it, because then you would look at the government and go, wait, we didn't sign up for this.
Right. Well, they don't want to just come out and say
Well,
so they can. But
because they're doing illegal things.
Because they know.
Exactly.
And so, wow. I mean, Eddie and I, we talk to many people about, situations like this, and your book, we've never really had somebody talk about the actual torture of what the government does or military does. So, again, looking at you, this amazing, smart professor, I mean, you've seen after 9/11, but what made you say, you know what, I'm going to put this on paper. I want to put
Wake
this
up.
Yeah, and in this subject can be very controversial and threaten the higher higher at bees. So you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. I don't know how much a threat I am, but I will say, uh, we live in the United States of America. This is the most powerful country in the world.
Right.
We have the world's biggest military. We have the world's biggest nuclear arsenal. We have forts and bases all over the world in something like 100 countries
Wow.
around the world. We have a military presence. Our submarines are under the seas. Our destroyers are on the seas. Those of us who benefit from the privilege of living in this country and all that it makes possible for not all of us by any means, but for
Right.
some of us, we have a responsibility as citizens of this country to know what our government is doing. And if we find that our government is contradicting the very values that make this country supposedly someplace we want to be proud of, then we have a responsibility to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as long as we are at least nominally a democratic country, we also, as citizens, have a responsibility. And so that's sort of when I teach in my classes, part of what I tell my students at the end of the semester is, my secret goal was that you would leave this class thinking of yourselves as citizens of somewhere, maybe of your own country, but certainly citizens of the world.
Mm.
And that means having a responsibility for how we treat that world.
And Rebecca, when you look at other countries, are you sometimes surprised in a good or a bad way when you look at other countries, like what's going on in Iceland and has been going on there for a while now in different other parts of the world, how quick the citizens are, especially in South America, over in Peru, where the people hit the streets, they get out there, they campaign, we don't want this trade agreement. We don't want this. And what they're chanting is, we don't want to become an American colony. All of these countries all over the world, I find, and I might be ignorant here, but I keep seeing them hitting the streets to correct a government, to imprison government officials that are robbing their country blind or doing things like this. What do you think takes this country? What is it that's taking us so long to wake up?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think there are a lot of different things going on. And I'll tell you one thing that I think is happening is, you probably know the expression, so broke I can't pay attention.
Yes.
Right. Yes.
And I think that, ever since about 1976, median wages, median incomes in this country have gone downhill.
Yeah.
Right.
And where it used to be that one adult working at a decent
40 hours a week.
40 hours a week could perhaps support another adult and children.
Yep.
Maybe think about owning their own home,
Yep.
have a vacation, have a retirement.
Mm-hmm.
That is all so precarious for so many people now,
Yeah.
that I think it's very hard, when your own life is really precarious, to care about or to pay attention to things that you really don't think you have any control over anyway. And I think that's part of it.
How much of that is deliberate?
Oh, well, and
That answered it before she even said anything.
how much of our reaction to the so-called war on terror has been orchestrated by what some people have called security theater.
Mm-hmm.
You go to the airport, you take off your shoes, you take off your belt, you take your computer out of your bag, you put your liquid things in an exactly quart-sized baggie, no bigger, no smaller. All of this is designed to remind you that you're in danger and only the government can protect you. And I think we've been kind of sold a bill of goods here, because this is sort of the deal. The deal is, you let us do mass collection of email, mass surveillance of cell phone use,
Spies.
mass all of that. You let us invade whatever countries we tell you we need to invade
To protect you.
to protect you. And in return, we promise that you will be secure. But it's a false promise.
Yes.
Because we live in a country where any fool can go on the internet and
Yes.
buy a semi-automatic weapon. We live in a country and we live in a world in which nothing you do can completely prevent two angry, disaffected college students from blowing up the finish line of the Boston Marathon.
That's
And I
right.
say this as someone who used to run marathons, and I have no desire to be blown up.
Yeah.
But it's a fake promise. It's as if the government were saying to us, let us do whatever we have to and you will never die.
Right.
And underneath that is every time you take your shoes off, every time you have to take your computer out of your bag, every time that swiper goes up and down you and you have to go back and you can't find your car keys or your driver's license in the airport, our anger, our frustration is toward these so-called terrorists, not with the very people that are lying to us about who the terrorists are.
Right.
Exactly. No, that's all of that is exactly right. And that is, intentional in the largest sense that, it doesn't mean someone is sitting there like the master puppeteer running the people at the TSA, but the end effect is exactly reminding us that we're in danger. And this is certainly intentional. And there's no question that, to get sort of to some of the subject matter of the second book, there's no question that the Bush administration took advantage of the attacks of September 11th to put into play plans that they came into the White House with. And one of the biggest ones of those was the invasion of Iraq.
Oh yeah, they had that plan. This was just either the excuse or the reason for 9/11. And so I'm going to ask you about this new book because I'm a big history buff. I love anything with the Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War I, World War II, and most generations, a lot of the younger generations, they don't really look into the past. They don't look at the history and the Nuremberg trials or tribunals. Listen, I watched on Netflix. They have it on Netflix of the trials. And I found it very, very fascinating. But you wrote your book, the brand new book that was just out, I believe, this month, American Nuremberg. And the U.S. officials who should stand trial for post 9/11 war crimes. And speaking of Bush administration, but so tell us why you chose that title and how you tied the two together.
Very good. So, to be perfectly honest, I didn't choose the title. The editor came to me and said, I heard you on the radio talking about mainstreaming torture, and I would like to have you write a book, and here's the title.
Wow.
And I said, oh. And to be honest, I wasn't crazy about the title, and here's why. I was born in the 1950s. I grew up with parents who lived through World War II. My dad's family were Orthodox Jews. My dad fell away from that, but he still was very much a Jew. And I was raised to understand that the greatest, most terrible things that had ever been done in the history of humanity were done by the Third Reich under Hitler. And when you look at the reality of World War II, upwards of 85 million people died in that war, when you count the war in Asia and the war in Europe. Most of them were civilians. It was the largest slaughterhouse the world has ever seen. And the kinds of crimes of extermination, of experimentation, the things that were done under the Nazi regime were in some ways unprecedented in the world, and they were terrible. Yeah. And so part of me is saying, the crimes of the war on terror are really crimes, and they are bad, and people have been murdered and tortured to death, and entire countries have been laid waste by unnecessary, unprovoked wars. But it doesn't rise to the same level of carnage that we saw in the middle of the 20th century with the Second World War. Nonetheless, what happened at Nuremberg was also in some ways unprecedented, because it was the very first time that the nations of the world came together and said, we have international laws, we have international treaties, and when nations and the heads of nations violate those laws, there needs to be a legitimate way to call them to account and to bring justice to them. And it wasn't an easy thing because the obvious way that the world would see this would be as victor's justice, right? The US, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union won the war, so they get to be the ones who sit in judgment. And in fact, that's what happened. And there were many people who supported Nuremberg who actually thought that after the trials of Germany and perhaps the trials of some of the Japanese officials, that there would also be trials that dealt with war crimes committed by the Allies. As we know, that never happened.
Mm-mm.
And when I say crimes, war crimes by the Allies, the kinds of things I'm thinking about were the direct air attacks on civilians in Germany, especially Dresden, and in more than 50 cities in Japan that were absolutely burned to the ground because they were mostly built out of wood. And those cities were firebombed to
I hear a
Oh.
doggy.
yes, you heard my cat.
Oh, cat.
He is not part of the show, but if he comes back, maybe. So but what they did in at Nuremberg was they came together, these four groups, and already the US knew it was going to be entering into some kind of conflict with the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, they were able in those moments to put together a charter, a set of rules under which these people would be tried, the procedures that would be used, and although they were very imperfect, these tribunals, I believe, actually did result in some kind of justice. Not perfect justice, imperfect human justice, but justice. And so when I say we need an American Nuremberg, what I'm saying is that the nations of the world have just as much investment now and maybe even more in holding the heads of government of the United States to account
Yes.
as the victors did at the end of World War II.
Wow. And for a lot of people, we know why you're passionate about this because you've articulated it and it just vibrates off of you.
Right.
It's like, wake up, people. But the electricity that you exude when you speak about it is something we appreciate a lot here. So, Rebecca, I want to ask you for the audience that doesn't know, what is it that constitutes a war crime?
That's a really good question, and there's no reason people would necessarily know. And the answer actually goes way back in history.
Oh, wow.
So there are two kinds of law, international law about war. There's the written down law, and then there's what are called the laws and customs of war. But in both of those, there are certain things that are considered absolutely unacceptable and are crimes. Number one, and this is the key one actually, and this was the number one crime that the Nazi leaders were tried for, which a lot of people don't know, which is making an aggressive or unprovoked war. Historically, the nations of the world have decided, and you'll find this in the UN Charter as well as in treaties that the US signed back in the 1920s, that it is against international law to make an unprovoked military attack on another country. The only legitimate reason for attacking a country under international law is if you have been attacked by that country first. This means that the attack on Iraq is absolutely a criminal act,
Yeah.
and it is the source of many of the other war crimes, including the torture, because the earliest tortures that were after the people in Brooklyn that I told you about at the beginning, the earliest people who were picked up outside the United States and were tortured, it was because they wanted to make them say that Saddam Hussein was in some way connected with September 11th.
Oh, that is-
But once you've got a war going, there are other things you can do that are war crimes. The next really important point is the separation between people who are actually part of the war. So that includes combatants, people who are fighting the war, and civilians, people who are not engaged in fighting the war. And the first thing you have to do if you fight a war is keep that distinction as clear as possible. And to the largest extent possible, you should only attack or kill or hurt people who are actually soldiers in the war. Everyone else is supposed to be protected. And then there are other people who are specifically, especially supposed to be protected, and that includes medical personnel and journalists.
Yep.
Then there's the question of people who have been captured in the course of a war. And here, this is where it's got an odd name, but the Geneva Conventions are actually part of what's called international humanitarian war
Mm.
or humanitarian law. And you might not expect that name, but what that means is that, and because of the history, it used to be that when people were injured on a battlefield, there was nobody who took care of them. And they would just lie out on the battlefield and die.
Uh,
And there was a Swiss man who observed this at a battle that took place between France and Italy in the 1800s, and he was so horrified that he eventually created what we now call the International Committee of the Red Cross, and his work created the first Geneva Conventions, which dealt primarily with the question of how prisoners of war and people who have been injured in war are to be treated. So, when you mistreat prisoners of war, and that includes torturing them or making them submit to cruel or inhuman treatment,
Right.
it also includes holding them with as ghost prisoners, so nobody knows where they are or that you even have them. All of those things are violations of the latest Geneva Conventions, are those that were signed after World War II in 1949.
And well, you've actually, I mean, you explained it great, and I think a lot of people didn't know what
I
is
didn't.
classified as a war crime.
Yeah.
And since 9/11, and we know, and I guess we could probably pick, but I want you to give us some examples of what under the Bush administration, and some people might be surprised, maybe under Obama's administration.
Great
Could you give
question.
some examples?
Absolutely. So I mentioned the attack on Iraq and the war on Iraq. And a lot of people in this country don't know how many people have died and been displaced by that war. We've seen the results on our own soldiers, and we've seen how shamefully, frankly, the veterans of that war have been treated when they came home. But what we don't know is that depending on how you measure it, somewhere between 250 million and 1 million people have died in Iraq as a result of
Wow.
the war that began in 2003. And that doesn't even count the people who lost their homes, who've been displaced, who've had to leave from, one neighborhood, one city where they and their families had lived for generations and moved to somewhere else. And it doesn't count the people who've been tortured and imprisoned, both by the United States government and by the al-Maliki government, which we put in place after the invasion. And it doesn't count the further destabilization that was part of the original plan going back to the 1990s, that was published by a group called the Project for a New American Century, that starts with Iraq and that goes on to include destabilizing Syria. So today, we now have over half the population of Syria have had to leave their homes. 5 million of them are outside the country, refugees, all because of a destabilization we began in Iraq. And so that's one thing. So that's one set of crimes.
Right.
Then we have the torture.
Oh.
And torture is itself, if it happens in the context of a war, it's a war crime. And if it happens outside the context of a war, it's still a crime, both a federal crime and a crime under the UN Convention Against Torture, which the US has signed and ratified. It gets a little complicated because we have to ask ourselves the question, is this so-called war on terror, a war against an emotion, is that really a war?
Wow.
And the answer is that in a legal sense, it's not, because it doesn't involve a sustained, heavy conflict between armies. And so I would say that the crimes committed in Afghanistan and in Iraq are actual war crimes. The crimes that have been committed against the hundreds of people or the thousands who have been basically kidnapped off the streets in places as varied as Italy and Macedonia and taken and tortured by the CIA or taken to Guantanamo and held incommunicado without any sense of when they're ever going to be freed. Many of those don't actually count as war crimes because they didn't happen on a field of battle, but they are still international crimes. They are still violations of US and international law. And so part of the problem we have is that when we say the word human rights violation, it just doesn't have that same rhetorical power. It doesn't have that oomph as the words war crimes. And yet, they can refer to exactly the same kind of activity that cause exactly the same kind of human torment. But human rights just doesn't carry that same power the way perhaps it ought to. So I call those things violations of human rights.
Well, and all countries are supposed to abide by the exact same international standards, right?
And this is another problem because there is even an international court called the International Criminal Court that exists to bring people to those international standards. And so again, there are two sets of standards. There are the ones that are composed of treaties that countries have actually signed. And so that includes the UN Charter for any nation that's in the UN, which is pretty much almost every nation in the world. Yeah. And it also includes these customs of war that maybe are not spoken or not written down, but which are thought to be international in scope, like keeping the distinction between civilians and soldiers. So yes, every nation is held to those. So at the International Criminal Court, if a country won't try its own war criminals, we have the possibility of bringing those criminals into this internationally conducted court that takes place at The Hague in the Netherlands. The problem for us in the United States, if we want to see our own people brought to book, is that criminal court doesn't include the United States.
What?
We signed the initial treaty that created the court, but it was never ratified by the Senate. And in 2002, after September 11th, Donald Rumsfeld wrote to the agency that runs the court and said, we are withdrawing our signature and we are never going to ratify it. And then Congress passed a law that makes it illegal to assist in bringing any U.S. national to trial at the International Criminal Court. And the law even says, and we'll send in the army to set them free if anybody tries to bring a U.S. national to the ICC.
Which, let me think, this is why people effing hate most U.S. citizens.
Well, it's why we have a hard time in the world. It's why, on the one hand, we're often very naive. It's sort of like the rest of the world has to know about the United States because we're the big kid in the playground. But we don't have this vital necessity to understand the rest of the world. No. And so, sadly, we don't. And so then we're surprised when people demonstrate against the United States. We're like, but we're the good guys. Why don't you love us? Because we don't actually understand what our own giant boots are doing, what we're stepping on around the world.
Well, I want to ask you, after the agreement, after World War II, how long did it take, or I don't know if you have this research, how long did it take before that was broken?
Which agreement are you talking
about? Well, about anything with the war crimes, because
it just never. In terms of, well, I'll tell you one thing that the Allies decided, and this is really interesting. One of the things they were concerned about was what's called this atque tu, which means you too, you did it also argument. And so you'll notice that among the things that they tried the Nazi leaders for, one thing they didn't try them for was the Blitz in London. There were no charges brought about aerial bombardments of civilian populations. And that was because they were afraid that somebody would say, well, you did it too. You did it to Germany. And so the idea that there was going to be this ongoing tribunal, it took another 50 years for that tribunal to be created. And really the International Criminal Court is what they dreamed of all those years ago. In the meantime, though, there have been two other tribunals that were held on the model of Nuremberg. And these are the tribunal that are still going on, that are trying people responsible for what they called ethnic cleansing when the former Yugoslavia broke up, and the tribunal for the crimes, the genocide that took place in Rwanda in 1994. So these are sort of descendants, not direct descendants, but descendants of Nuremberg.
How can the United States constantly stay off the hook when we are the bully on the playground?
And can we?
Yeah, and how much longer will we be
Yeah.
able to do that? Not us nice people, but the ones passing the laws.
Well, that's an interesting question. And, there's a sense in which we could think of the United States as an empire. We have military extension all over the globe. We have we have extraction of resources all over the world. We have ways of interfering in the governmental activities of countries around the world. There's a sense in which we are a modern, although not official, empire like the British Empire, but we're an empire. Every empire fades. History has never seen an empire that lasted forever. And I think that part of what's going on in the current period is that we are reaching the limits of our power.
Yep.
We're reaching them economically.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what's happened as a result of reaching them is that the very wealthiest people can no longer afford, if they are going to hold on to their huge wealth, to keep a high living standard for working people in this country. So we're beginning to feel the result of that. We're also facing new military challenges, but I think the biggest challenges are economic. And of course, the whole world faces this other challenge, which is the change in the climate.
Yeah.
And I think that because we are an empire that is fading, that's in some ways the moment at which we're most desperate and therefore most dangerous.
And
So I think that, as I said at the beginning, I've been lucky enough to be part of a number of movements
Yep.
for liberation around the world, and I have seen the world change in my lifetime. I have seen women become human beings,
Yeah.
whereas, early in my lifetime, there was some question about whether we were, really human the way people with different plumbing are.
Yep.
And I have seen certainly not complete change and certainly not perfect end to racism, but I have seen changes in the lives of people of African descent in this country that still have a long ways to go, but are changes. And I've seen the revolution in Nicaragua, which again, completely imperfect, but there are some genies you can't put back in the bottle. When people who have really thought most of their lives that they were not very different from the beasts of burden that they work with in relationship to the rich owners of land, and they suddenly have this awareness, oh, I'm a human being, you can't put that back in the bottle.
No, you can't devolve. You can only evolve. Once you wake up, you don't go backwards. You go
Right.
up.
Right.
That's what I believe. I am so hopeful about, and this is going to sound really strange because we're seeing something that looks very close to genuine fascism in one wing of the campaign for the presidency these days. And that's scary.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we are seeing young people, my students, who 5 years ago, if I had asked, how many of you plan to vote in the election, out of a class of 25, I might have seen 2 hands.
Yep.
Wow.
And now I'm seeing these people really engaged, really feeling like this is an important election and their futures are wrapped up in the direction that their country takes, and they're sitting up and they're taking notice. And so I have to be hopeful. There are things we can do. I'll tell you one thing that makes me hopeful. It's brand new. It's something the Obama administration did in the last couple of weeks that blew me away. It's flying under the radar. In a week or two, you will see a story about it in the New York Times. It's gotten as far as the LA Times. But up until now, every time somebody who has gotten free from Guantanamo or who has been freed after being tortured by the CIA in some other place has come and tried to sue the U.S. government. So I'm not talking about criminal charges here. I'm talking about a civil suit for damages for what you did to me. The federal government has blocked that suit and had it thrown out of court on the basis that national security secrets would be revealed if the trial were allowed to go forward. Now, this is a violation of the UN Convention Against Torture, which we've ratified, which says explicitly one of the things we're required to do is allow people to seek redress for the harm that they have suffered. But this last couple of weeks, for the first time, the in district court in DC, the Obama administration has allowed a federal suit to go forward
Oh, that's
by
great.
somebody who was tortured specifically by the CIA, and by these two contractors who are named Mitchell and Jessen, and who were psychologists working for the CIA, who basically designed their torture program. And the Obama administration, for the first time, is allowing that suit to go forward. And this is the thin wedge, but
Yeah.
it's a beginning because it's going to open things up in a new way. And I'm feeling more hopeful than I have about some kind of justice. And it's interesting. I have friends who work with people who have been victims of torture and human rights abuses, and I have friends who work in the legal world of trying to bring torturers to justice. And one of the things that they tell me is the very first thing that people need when they want justice is their stories need to be told in a venue in which people can listen and take them seriously. That having the story told is 90% of justice.
And that's what which is a great segue question, slightly off topic, but I feel like it's connected because, in my opinion, it was an emotional, psychological torture when I was a kid growing up. And Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, I was a kid. I was livid. I was infuriated at the way that was handled and how literally she was beat up.
Yep.
And my question is, if that happened today, what do you think, because we only have like 4 minutes left, what do you think would have been the outcome today versus then?
I think it would have been very different.
Me too.
I really do. I think that people would have, as the bumper sticker used to say, I believe Anita Hill.
Yep.
And I think it would have been different. And I think that's because of a number of things. It's because of the young women who have built the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter movement. And it's because of the struggle for women's liberation. And it's because we understand these things better. You know, it's interesting. I went around the country in 2014 giving talks about mainstreaming torture. And at the end of almost every time that I spoke, somebody, a woman in the back, would get up and say, you know, when you describe the act, which I didn't do today, but when you describe the actual psychological effects of torture and the way it makes you doubt your own perception of the world, she would say, I'm a survivor of domestic violence, and that's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's true. It's a form of institutionalized torture.
Yeah.
And that's what I think. You know, I think that what Anita Hill suffered was institutionalized abuse.
I do too.
Well, I have to say this needed to be a 2-hour interview
I
because there's so
know.
much to talk about, and in the short amount of time we have left, you know, with the political season underway, and you know we're almost to the general election. I have to say, you know, there's some scary stuff going on with some of our, especially on the Republican side, because in fact, I just heard, was it yesterday, when, you know, Bobby Knight endorsed Donald Trump, and he referred to Trump, comparing him to Truman, when Truman dropped the bomb on, you know, Japan, and he said Donald Trump would do the same thing. You know,
and he's exactly right, I'm afraid.
And so
with Ted Cruz.
So we had 8 years of the Obama administration, and we didn't really get to talk much about the Bush administration, and we had 8 years of Obama, and we didn't talk much about the drone attacks. But do you see us reliving over again?
Oh, God.
Because if the Republicans, they're pretty much, you know, they're a war machine. They always put more money into the military power. And do you see that could set us back even more if we get the wrong people in office?
Oh, yeah, of course it could. And I think there are a couple of reasons why it's really important that we elect whoever the Democratic candidate turns out to be. I can say 2 words: Supreme Court. That's
Right.
part of it.
That's right.
But let me also say that the congressional elections in some ways are going to be just as important as the
Yes.
presidential election, because for 8 years, the Republican Party has held Congress hostage and has
Yeah.
made it almost impossible for the administration to get anything done. And we can't go on like that. I don't think that Trump represents a majority. But the Nazis were not a majority either.
That's
And
right.
I'm not saying it's the same situation. I am saying
A lot of similarities, but there's
he
not
has
the same
the same
situation.
willingness to use racial attacks and the same ideological agility. He's willing to say whatever he thinks will fly at that moment.
Right.
But I do think that what he represents is dangerous, and a big part of it is exactly what Hitler represented, which was people who believed that what they ought to have had been taken away from them. And there are a lot of white people in this country who believe that the reason that they are suffering now and afraid now and precarious now is not because of the people who are really responsible, but because of people of a different color.
Yep.
That if it weren't for them, their lives would be the way they think they ought to be.
Yep.
And that's a scary thing. When people are desperate, they're dangerous.
Yep. And that's all part of the whole machine.
Well, you're going to have to come back. I don't care if you say no or not. We're going to drag you back.
I know. We're going to have you.
There's so many other questions to ask.
Oh, I'm dying to ask one more. Can I?
Go for
I
it.
promise
Go for
it'll
it.
be
Go
quick.
for it.
Why the F, when you have a president of the United States, whether you agree or disagree with that president during that term, how is it remotely even possible that you have a whole group of people in that house that sit there with their arms crossed, block every single thing that comes through that would benefit humanity as a whole? Why do they get to A, keep their jobs? And how do they keep their jobs? If we don't do our job, we don't get paid. We get fired.
Well, let me tell you, one of the ways they did it is by ginning up the anger of white people towards a black man in the White House.
That's true.
There are people for whom black and president are a contradiction in terms. There's something else, though, that's a little more inside baseball and technical. But the fact is that the Republicans have managed, through gerrymandering, to carve out congressional districts for themselves that are completely safe. And you may not remember, but a few years ago, they actually there were a group of Democrats who left the state of Texas rather than allow a quorum to be in place because they had come back in the middle of the decade with a new reapportionment plan the Republicans in Texas wanted to put in place. And in the end, they succeeded in putting in place a new reapportionment plan that even more securely locked in their districts. So that's why they've been able to get away with it. But a lot of it has to do with stirring up. I was on a show the other night with some folks who are opposed to the government from the right, and their language for President Obama, they call him Generalissimo Hussein.
Oh, my Lord.
Wow.
And they are speaking to a group of people who think that that's perfectly reasonable language.
Yeah. And they're,
Very sad.
God.
Yeah.
And so we're shifting this stuff now.
Yep.
It's time. And we're able to shift it because of people like you, Rebecca.
And we appreciate you.
And thank you so much for having me on.
It's
really
a pleasure.
enjoyed it.
Yeah,
it's a pleasure.
please come back. And so for everybody listening, Rebecca Gordon, her website is mainstreamingtorture.org, and her phenomenal book is American Nuremberg. Please go support the book. And we know you're going to be around doing more lectures and radio things, so check everything out on her website, mainstreamingtorture.org, and please get her book, American Nuremberg. Thank you so much, Rebecca. We appreciate it.
We do.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Oh, please. And so come back soon. And
I
we
will.
definitely will have this up on iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, YouTube. If you guys missed it, do not miss this show. We have to get out of here. But, Rebecca, we so appreciate you. One more applause.
Yay! Hercules!
Thank you, my dear. Appreciate it. All right. Bye-bye. And if you guys, if you guys want to contact us, just go to truthbetoldwebtv.com. Please email us. We'd love to hear from you. Any other guests that you'd like to see on our show, we'd love to have them on. And please go back and listen to our podcast. Subscribe to us on YouTube. And we didn't do our advertisements, but we want to make sure Contact in the Desert.
Yep.
June the 3rd through the 5th or 6th. I can't remember. June 6th, I think. But go to truthbetoldwebtv.com. Enter to win tickets.
And those are
free.
some expensive tickets.
They're very expensive, but there's some of the top UFO experts in the world. I mean, you will not regret it. It's in Joshua Tree. Beautiful.
I've never been.
You've never been there?
Nope.
It's beautiful. So, all right, Eddie, it was a great show.
It was a great show. And it went by so quick.
Both of them.
And we have two beautiful women, very strong spirits, great information that's changing the world. That's why we do the show.
That's right. And this is Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
Until next week, bye.
Bye, y'all.